By the late 19th century, as the United States was still struggling to define itself in the aftermath of the Civil War, the great cities along the East Coast began to change shape faster than at any previous moment in the nation's history. New York, Chicago, Newport, Pittsburgh did not simply grow in population or industrial capacity. They transformed visually, deliberately, almost obsessively. Streets once lined with modest brick houses and functional workshops were overtaken by structures of limestone, marble, and steel, taller, heavier, and more imposing than anything Americans had known before. These buildings were not constructed merely to be lived in. They were constructed to speak. And what they spoke of, unmistakably, was power. This period would later be called the Gilded Age, a name that was both glittering and deeply ironic. For the gold was only on the surface. Beneath it lay a society strained by inequality, instability, and the rapid rise of a new elite attempting to legitimize unprecedented wealth through architecture. Families such as the Vanderbilts, Astors, Morgans, and Carnegies were not only accumulating fortunes at astonishing speed. They were entering a quiet competition with one another, a race to determine who could leave the most permanent mark on the American landscape. Architecture became their chosen instrument, not an instrument of comfort, but of legitimacy. The grand mansions along Fifth Avenue, the so-called summer cottages of Newport, Rhode Island, and the European-style chateaux rising improbably from the mountains of North Carolina all carried the same underlying message. Their owners were not merely rich. They were meant to be remembered. The most prominent architects of the era were commissioned. Materials were imported from Europe. Italian Renaissance palaces, French Baroque estates, and English Gothic traditions were copied with precision. This was not about practicality. It was about borrowing the weight of history. In the eyes of these industrial magnates, Europe possessed what America lacked: a past. And a past was something new money could not yet provide on its own. Here, a fundamental contradiction began to take shape. These buildings were conceived as symbols of permanence, yet the social foundations that produced them were remarkably fragile. The wealth that funded their marble staircases and gilded ceilings was generated by laborers working 12, 14 hours a day in steel mills, coal mines, and factories. Strikes, labor uprisings, and financial panics erupted with regularity during this so-called golden era. The distance between the wealthy and the working poor did not merely widen. It became visible, etched directly into the urban environment itself. Gilded Age architecture, then, is not simply a history of beauty or engineering achievement. It is a history of anxiety. Anxiety over being dismissed as newly rich. Anxiety over being forgotten by history. Anxiety that unless money could be transformed into stone, columns, frescoed ceilings, and sweeping staircases, it might vanish as quickly as it appeared. In their effort to resist impermanence, America's upper class created buildings that were both magnificent and burdensome, admired and resented in equal measure. And in doing so, they laid the groundwork for a far more unsettling question. What was the true cost of these symbols? History provides a sobering answer. Few of these structures survived in their original form or purpose. Many were demolished within decades. Others were converted into museums, hotels, or public institutions. Some were simply abandoned, left standing like fossils of ambition that had outgrown its moment. The stone walls remained, but the families who built them did not. The collapse of America's upper class did not occur in a single dramatic instant. It unfolded gradually through economic crises, shifting tax laws, social change, and a transformation in cultural values. And architecture, assumed to be the most permanent of human creations, became the most honest witness to that decline. The next chapter of this story we'll move deeper into the economic and social conditions that allowed a small group of Americans to accumulate power on a scale never before seen in the nation's history, and why they believed architecture was the only way to turn temporary wealth into something resembling permanence. The explosion of monumental architecture during the Gilded Age did not emerge from taste alone. It was the physical consequence of a specific economic moment, one in which the United States experienced a concentration of wealth unlike anything in its previous history. In the decades following the Civil War, industrial capitalism accelerated at a pace that outstripped regulation, tradition, and moral consensus. Railroads stitched the continent together. Steel replaced wood. Coal-powered factories that never slept, and at the center of it all stood a small group of men who learned how to convert scale into dominance. This was an era before income tax, before meaningful antitrust enforcement, before labor protections carried real force. Fortunes were built not slowly, across generations, but violently fast through consolidation, speculation, and the ruthless elimination of competitors. A single merger could generate more wealth than an entire town would see in a lifetime, and because the system lacked mechanisms to redistribute or restrain that accumulation, money pooled upward with astonishing efficiency. Yet raw wealth, especially when acquired so quickly, carried a social problem. The American elite of the 19th century did not inherit aristocratic legitimacy. There were no ancient titles, no medieval castles, no centuries-old bloodlines to anchor their authority. What they possessed instead was capital, and capital alone was insufficient to command cultural respect. Architecture became the bridge between money and meaning. By erecting structures that echoed European palaces and aristocratic estates, America's new elite attempted to compress history. Stone facades replaced lineage. Imported marbles stood in for ancestry. A Beaux-Arts mansion on Fifth Avenue functioned as a visual argument that its owner belonged not merely to the present economy, but to an imagined continuum of power stretching backward through time. These buildings were not homes in the traditional sense. They were statements, meant to be read by the public and interpreted by posterity. But the economy that made such architecture possible was fundamentally unstable. Beneath the appearance of endless growth lay cycles of boom and collapse that repeatedly exposed the system's fragility. Financial panics in 1873, 1893, and 1907 did not merely shake markets. They erased fortunes, destabilized banks, and revealed how interconnected and vulnerable the entire structure had become. Each crisis left behind unfinished buildings, abandoned projects, and estates suddenly too expensive to maintain. The contradiction grew sharper with each passing year. While mansions expanded, wages stagnated. While ballrooms glittered, tenement housing overflowed. While architects were instructed to spare no expense, workers were instructed to accept less. The physical distance between elite neighborhoods and working-class districts shrank in geography but widened in meaning. Wealth no longer hid itself. It towered overhead. Public sentiment began to shift. What had once been admired as ambition increasingly appeared as excess. Newspapers ran exposés. Reformers documented working conditions. Journalists began asking questions that architecture could not answer. Why did a single family require 40 rooms while thousands lacked basic sanitation? Why did marble staircases matter more than public schools? Why did beauty seem to belong only to those who could afford it? Even within the upper class, doubt crept in. These great houses demanded constant upkeep. Servants, heating systems, imported materials, specialized craftsmen. What had begun as a demonstration of power slowly transformed into a burden. The larger the estate, the more fragile it became. A downturn in the market, a shift in tax policy, or the death of a patriarch could render a palace financially unsustainable almost overnight. Architecture, once envisioned as the solution to impermanence, now magnified it. A modest home could adapt to changing times. A vast mansion could not. It required wealth not only to build, but to preserve indefinitely. And the American system, unlike the European aristocracies it sought to imitate, did not guarantee permanence. It rewarded success, but offered no protection against reversal. As the 20th century approached, the tension between image and reality became impossible to ignore. The same economic forces that had raised the towers of steel and stone were beginning to undermine the social order that justified them. Progressive reform, antitrust action, and the introduction of income taxation would soon challenge the very assumptions upon which Gilded Age architecture had been built. The question was no longer whether these buildings were impressive. It was whether they could survive the world that was changing around them. The next part of this story will move from systems to structures, examining specific mansions, estates, and urban palaces as case studies, and tracing how their rise and eventual decline mirrored the fortunes of the families who built them. To understand how Gilded Age architecture ultimately failed the people who built it, one must step inside the houses themselves, not as visitors admiring their scale, but as witnesses to the lives they were designed to contain. These structures were conceived as permanent anchors in a society still defining its future. Yet from the moment their foundations were laid, they were already out of sync with the country around them. Along Fifth Avenue in New York City, mansions rose one after another, forming a corridor of private power unprecedented in American urban history. Behind their limestone facades and iron gates lived families whose wealth rivaled that of European nobility. Interiors were arranged according to rigid hierarchies. Public rooms were designed for display. Private quarters were pushed upward or hidden behind corridors. Servants moved through back staircases and narrow hallways, present everywhere and nowhere at once. These were not merely homes. They were machines for social performance. Every architectural decision carried meaning. Ceiling heights communicated status. Imported tapestries and carved wood paneling declared cultural literacy. Ballrooms were built not because families danced often, but because they might need to. The possibility of hosting mattered more than the reality. Space itself became a form of insurance against social exclusion. To lack a grand dining room or a formal reception hall was to risk invisibility among one's peers. Yet these buildings demanded constant consumption. Coal had to be delivered daily to heat cavernous interiors. Staff numbers often exceeded those of small hotels. Roofs, plumbing, and electrical systems required specialized maintenance at a time when such technologies were still unreliable. What appeared effortless from the outside was sustained by a fragile balance of money, labor, and routine. Any disruption threatened the entire structure. In Newport, Rhode Island, the summer estates revealed this contradiction even more starkly. Built for a season that lasted only weeks, these palatial cottages consumed resources year-round. Entire households migrated north each summer, bringing furniture, servants, and social obligations with them. When the season ended, the buildings fell silent, vast, and empty, waiting to be justified again the following year. Their scale assumed continuity. Their function depended on ritual. When the ritual weakened, the architecture lost its purpose. The turning point often arrived quietly. A death, a financial downturn, a change in inheritance laws. A new generation less willing to shoulder the burden of preservation. These houses were rarely abandoned in moments of drama. They faded. Rooms were closed off. Staff dismissed. Repairs delayed. What had once symbolized permanence began to decay from within. By the early 20th century, many heirs discovered that these mansions were no longer assets, but liabilities. Property taxes rose. Urban land values shifted. The cost of maintaining a house designed for 19th century wealth collided with a 20th century economy increasingly skeptical of excess. Some families attempted to donate their estates to the public, hoping museums or institutions might absorb the cost. Others sold them off, often at a fraction of their original value. Many were demolished entirely, their materials salvaged, their names erased from the streets they once dominated. The architecture had outlived the social logic that created it. What remained was an uncomfortable truth. These buildings were never meant to adapt. They were meant to assert. And assertion, unlike flexibility, does not age well. As America moved toward modernity, efficiency replaced display as a cultural value. Smaller homes, apartments, and office buildings better suited the pace of urban life. The mansion, once a symbol of arrival, became a symbol of stubbornness and unwillingness to accept that power in America was no longer tied to stone walls and inherited space. Yet even in decline, these structures continued to shape memory. Their ruins, their photographs, their repurposed halls still whispered of a moment when wealth believed it could outrun time. In trying to build forever, the Gilded Age elite revealed something far more human, a fear of disappearance, and a misunderstanding of the world they were helping to create. The next part of this story will follow what happened when those misunderstandings collided with national reform, public backlash, and the rise of a new moral language that challenged the legitimacy of excess itself. By the opening years of the 20th century, the world that had made Gilded Age architecture possible was beginning to turn against it. The shift did not arrive suddenly, nor did it come from a single source. It emerged gradually, through legislation, journalism, economic pressure, and a growing public belief that unchecked wealth was no longer compatible with the nation's ideals. What had once been celebrated as success now attracted scrutiny, and the great houses that lined America's cities and resorts became unavoidable symbols of imbalance. Progressive reformers did not attack architecture directly. They attacked the system that sustained it. Antitrust laws challenged monopolies that had generated vast fortunes. Labor reforms gave workers new leverage. Journalists exposed industrial abuses in language that reached a mass audience for the first time. Wealth was no longer invisible, and it was no longer silent. It had addresses, facades, and floor plans that could be pointed to. The introduction of the federal income tax in 1913 marked a decisive rupture. For the first time, extraordinary wealth faced a recurring obligation to the state. Property taxes increased. Estate taxes followed. What had once been accumulated and preserved with minimal interference now had to be justified and maintained under constant financial pressure. The mansions, designed for a world without such constraints, suddenly stood exposed. At the same time, cultural attitudes were shifting. The idea that public virtue resided in restraint rather than display gained ground. Excess began to look out of step with modern life. The very features that had once impressed grand staircases, cavernous halls, rooms used only once a year were reinterpreted as inefficiencies. In an age increasingly shaped by speed, mobility, and practicality, permanence felt less like strength and more like rigidity. World War I accelerated this transformation. The language of sacrifice reshaped national priorities. While young men were sent overseas and factories converted to wartime production, private luxury became difficult to defend. Maintaining a staff of dozens to serve a single household clashed with the moral atmosphere of the moment. Even families who retained their wealth felt pressure to downsize, donate, or withdraw from public display. Many of the great houses entered a transitional phase. Portions were closed off to reduce costs. Interiors were stripped of decorative elements and sold. Art collections were dispersed. In some cases, entire buildings were leased or transferred to institutions that could absorb their scale: schools, clubs, museums, government offices. This was not preservation in the romantic sense. It was survival through repurposing. Yet not all structures could be saved. Urban land values rose, and the economics of real estate shifted decisively. A mansion occupying an entire city block no longer made sense in a world that prioritized density and return on investment. Demolition became an act of pragmatism rather than iconoclasm. One by one, the architectural statements of the Gilded Age vanished, replaced by apartment buildings, offices, and commercial towers better suited to the new century. What made this collapse especially striking was its quietness. There were no ceremonies marking the end of an era, no official declarations. Just contracts signed, walls torn down, and photographs filed away. The disappearance of these buildings mirrored the disappearance of the social confidence that had produced them. Power had not been overthrown. It had been redefined. Architecture could no longer serve as a shield. Stone and marble offered no protection against taxation, reform, or changing values. The belief that wealth could be made permanent through physical form proved to be an illusion. In trying to freeze status in place, the Gilded Age elite had misunderstood the nature of American power, which flowed not from inheritance or monument, but from adaptability. The next part of this story will examine the afterlife of Gilded Age architecture, what survived, what was repurposed, and how these remnants continue to shape American memory long after the world that built them disappeared. When the Gilded Age receded, it did not disappear entirely. It left behind fragments, structures too large to ignore, too expensive to maintain, and too symbolically charged to be forgotten. These surviving buildings entered a second life, one shaped not by the ambitions of their builders, but by the needs and values of a society that no longer believed in what they represented. Some mansions found refuge in preservation, not because they were loved in their original form, but because they could be repurposed as evidence. Museums absorbed former private palaces and reframed them as public inheritance. Rooms once restricted to invitation-only gatherings were open to ticketed visitors. Docents replaced servants. Velvet ropes replaced social hierarchy. What had been built to separate now functioned to instruct. The architecture remained grand, but its authority was neutralized by interpretation. Other structures survived through institutional conversion. Universities acquired estates that could be transformed into campuses. Governments took possession of buildings that could be subdivided into offices. Hotels reconfigured ballrooms into banquet halls designed for paying guests rather than social obligation. In each case, survival required compromise. Walls were added. Wings were removed. Original functions were sacrificed. Permanence, once assumed, had to be negotiated. Yet even these adaptations carried tension. The scale of Gilded Age architecture resisted efficiency. Heating bills remained high. Maintenance demanded specialized skills. Preservation codes restricted alteration, while budgets constrained care. The buildings endured, but only by accepting a diminished role. They were no longer engines of power. They were artifacts of it. Many others did not survive at all. Their demolition was often justified as progress, but it also reflected discomfort. To destroy a mansion was to erase a visible reminder of inequality, excess, and a social order no longer considered defensible. In photographs taken before demolition, these houses appear intact, dignified, almost serene, unaware that their time had already ended. The wrecking ball did not fall in anger. It fell in silence. What remained after their disappearance was memory, uneven, selective, and often romanticized. Popular culture softened the edges. Films, novels, and television transformed the Gilded Age into a tableau of elegance and spectacle. Costumes and interiors were admired without confronting the systems that sustained them. The suffering that underwrote the stone was often omitted. The architecture was preserved as image, even when the buildings themselves were gone. This selective remembrance reveals a deeper truth. Gilded Age architecture endures less as physical form than as metaphor. It represents a moment when wealth believed it could stabilize itself through scale, when power assumed that visibility equaled legitimacy. The failure of that assumption is what gives these structures their lasting resonance. They are reminders not of triumph, but of miscalculation. In walking through a preserved mansion today, one senses the absence more than the presence. Rooms are impeccably restored, yet strangely hollow. The lives that once animated them are gone, and the values that justified them no longer command consensus. What remains is space beautiful, costly, and unresolved. The next part of this story will turn toward legacy, examining how the lessons of the Gilded Age influenced later American architecture and wealth behavior, and why modern elites, having learned from these ruins, chose invisibility over monument. By the middle of the 20th century, the lesson of the Gilded Age had been quietly absorbed by those who inherited its wealth. The great mistake of their predecessors was no longer debated openly, but it was clearly understood. Visibility had proven dangerous. Monument had proven vulnerable. Stone had failed to protect power. And so, a new strategy emerged, one defined not by display, but by retreat. The architecture of American wealth began to shrink, not in cost, but in presence. Fortunes continued to grow, in many cases surpassing those of the Gilded Age in real terms, yet their physical expressions became deliberately restrained. The modern elite no longer sought to dominate city blocks or skyline views. Instead, they dispersed. They purchased properties through trusts and holding companies. They built behind gates, along coastlines, in remote enclaves where scale was masked by landscape rather than proclaimed through stone. This shift was not merely aesthetic. It was psychological. Gilded Age architecture had functioned as a public declaration, an announcement of arrival. Modern wealth learned that arrival invited challenge. Taxation, regulation, public resentment, and political scrutiny followed visibility. The safest architecture was architecture that refused to speak. Modernist design played a crucial role in this transformation. Clean lines, minimal ornamentation, and private layouts aligned perfectly with a new ethic of discretion. A glass and steel house could be worth millions while appearing almost modest. A compound hidden in forest or desert could rival the size of a palace while leaving no impression on the urban imagination. Luxury became internal, experiential, and invisible. Corporate architecture followed a similar path, where 19th-century tycoons built headquarters that resembled cathedrals. 20th-century corporations favored anonymity. Office towers were designed to blend rather than dominate. Logos replaced ornament. Power moved from stone to paper, from facades to contracts, from architecture to systems. The result was a profound cultural reversal. In the Gilded Age, wealth sought permanence through physical mass. In the modern era, it sought longevity through flexibility. Buildings were no longer designed to last centuries. They were designed to adapt, to be sold, reconfigured, or abandoned without consequence. What mattered was not memory, but mobility. Yet the disappearance of monumental wealth did not eliminate inequality. It simply changed how inequality was experienced. The absence of visible excess made disparities harder to locate, harder to protest, harder to confront. The skyline no longer told the story. The architecture no longer confessed. This invisibility carried its own cost. Without monuments, there were fewer physical reminders of how wealth concentrated and how it collapsed. The ruins that once warned future generations were replaced by assets that could vanish without trace. The lesson of the Gilded Age survived, but its evidence faded. And yet, the old structures remained, scattered across the country, preserved, repurposed, or photographed into memory. They stood as anomalies, relics of a moment when power believed it needed to be seen. In their endurance, they offered a contrast to the present, reminding viewers that invisibility itself is a strategy, one learned through failure. The final part of this story will return to those surviving stones, not to mourn them, but to ask what they still teach. What remains when ambition outpaces understanding? And why the most enduring legacy of the Gilded Age is not its architecture, but the caution it carved into American consciousness. In the end, the story of Gilded Age architecture does not conclude with demolition, preservation, or reuse. It concludes in a quieter place, in the space between what was built and what was learned. Across the United States, fragments of that era still stand, not as triumphs, but as witnesses. Their walls have absorbed a century of reinterpretation. Their meaning has shifted, softened, and in some cases been deliberately obscured. Yet they remain heavy with implication. To walk through one of these surviving structures today is to feel a dissonance that no restoration can fully resolve. The craftsmanship is undeniable. The materials are exquisite. The scale is overwhelming. And yet the purpose that once animated these spaces is gone. The confidence that justified them has evaporated. What remains is form without consensus, beauty without authority, permanence without power. These buildings were never meant to be neutral. They were designed to instruct society on who belonged at the center and who did not. Their staircases guided movement. Their doors controlled access. Their rooms enforced hierarchy. In losing their original function, they lost their voice. But silence, too, communicates. It invites reflection. The Gilded Age elite believed that architecture could solve a problem that money alone could not. Legitimacy. They assumed that if wealth could be made visible enough, massive enough, historical enough, it would stabilize their place in the world. They mistook weight for permanence. They mistook scale for continuity. And in doing so, they revealed a deeper truth about American power, one that continues to shape the present. Power in the United States has never rested comfortably in monuments. It moves. It adapts. It hides when necessary. The attempt to fix it in stone was a misreading of the nation's character. Those who came after learned this lesson well. They abandoned the urge to be remembered through buildings and embraced systems that left fewer traces behind. And yet, the stones remain. They remind us that inequality once announced itself openly. That ambition once believed it could be eternal. That failure, when it arrived, did not destroy everything, but rewrote meaning. These structures no longer command obedience, but they still command attention. Perhaps that is their final function. Not to celebrate excess, nor to condemn it outright, but to hold memory in place long enough for questions to form. What do societies choose to monumentalize? What do they choose to hide? And what happens when the architecture outlives the values that created it? The Gilded Age did not end because its buildings fell. It ended because belief changed. And in the quiet endurance of stone and steel, we can still trace that transformation, not as nostalgia, but as warning. Long after the last Gilded Age mansion was demolished, sold, or repurposed, the pattern that created it did not disappear. It evolved. The stone palaces fell silent, but the forces that shaped them simply learned new forms of expression. What vanished was not excess itself, but the belief that excess needed to be monumental. In the decades that followed, American wealth continued to concentrate, often more efficiently than ever before. Yet its relationship with space changed fundamentally. Where the 19th century translated dominance into architecture, the modern era translated it into abstraction. Ownership moved from visible land to invisible portfolios. Power relocated from addresses to algorithms, from facades to financial instruments, from rooms filled with people to systems that operated without witnesses. This transformation made inequality less legible. In the Gilded Age, one could stand on a sidewalk and see the imbalance carved into stone. A mansion's shadow was literal, its presence undeniable. In the contemporary landscape, disparity is harder to locate. It hides behind legal structures, offshore accounts, and digital layers that leave no ruins behind. There are no empty ballrooms to walk through, no staircases echoing with absence. And yet, the absence itself has become a form of architecture. Gated communities designed to resemble nature rather than power. Glass towers that reflect the sky instead of asserting mass. Private spaces that retreat behind neutrality, making wealth appear weightless, even when it is not. What the Gilded Age attempted openly, the modern era achieves quietly. This raises a question that the old buildings continue to provoke simply by existing. Is invisibility a moral improvement, or merely a strategic one? Does the disappearance of monuments signal progress, or does it remove the physical reminders that once forced societies to confront imbalance directly? The surviving structures of the Gilded Age now occupy an uneasy role. They are preserved, photographed, admired, but rarely interrogated in full. They risk becoming aesthetic objects detached from their origins. Yet when approached honestly, they still offer clarity. They show what happens when wealth confuses durability with legitimacy, when power assumes that scale equals consent, when fear of impermanence drives creation rather than understanding. In this sense, these buildings are not relics of a finished past. They are incomplete conversations. They ask whether future societies will repeat the same cycle under different disguises, whether new forms of wealth will again seek to anchor themselves in space, or whether the lesson will hold. History suggests that the urge to monumentalize never fully disappears. It pauses, it waits, and when conditions allow, it returns in altered form. The Gilded Age was not an anomaly, it was a rehearsal. What remains then is not a conclusion but a responsibility. To read architecture not only as beauty or craft but as evidence. To understand that buildings, even when silent, speak of choices made and values tested. And to recognize that the true cost of architecture is never paid only in stone or money, but in how societies decide who is seen, who is hidden, and who is remembered. At the beginning of the 21st century, the United States entered another period of extraordinary wealth creation. Once again, a relatively small group accumulated fortunes at a speed that outpaced cultural understanding and political adaptation. Once again, inequality widened. And once again, society searched for ways to interpret what this concentration of power meant. The difference was not scale, it was visibility. The new elite did not build palaces of stone. They built platforms. Their power was not rooted in land, but in networks. Code replaced marble. Data replaced territory. Where the industrial titans of the Gilded Age transformed raw materials into physical dominance, the digital elite transformed attention into influence. And because their wealth required no visible mass, it required no visible justification. There were no Fifth Avenues for this new class. No corridors of private mansions announcing hierarchy. Their headquarters appeared interchangeable glass, steel, minimal, designed to suggest collaboration rather than command. Their homes, when noticed at all, were disguised as retreats, compounds folded into landscapes, or properties acquired through layers of anonymity. Architecture no longer declared arrival. It concealed it. This concealment altered public response. Without monuments, resentment lacked targets. Protest without a facade loses focus. In the Gilded Age, inequality could be photographed. It could be walked past. It could be pointed at. In the digital age, inequality is abstract, dispersed across screens and spreadsheets. It is felt, but rarely seen. Yet the underlying psychology remains strikingly familiar. Just as 19th century magnates feared being dismissed as temporary, modern elites fear instability of a different kind. Markets shift faster. Technologies age overnight. Relevance is fragile. The response is not permanence through stone, but dominance through speed and scale. Control is exercised not by occupying space, but by shaping behavior. Still, the old impulse has not vanished entirely. When digital wealth does reach for physical form, it does so cautiously. Private space replaces public statement. Security replaces symbolism. What is built is designed to withdraw, not to impress. The lesson of the Gilded Age has been learned, but not transcended. Visibility invites scrutiny. Invisibility preserves leverage. This evolution raises an unsettling possibility. The collapse of Gilded Age architecture provided society with ruins, evidence of excess and miscalculation that could be studied, preserved, and debated. The digital age may leave no such remains. When platforms fail, they disappear. When systems collapse, they are updated. There are no abandoned ballrooms in cyberspace, no staircases echoing with absence. And so the question returns, transformed but unresolved. If power no longer builds monuments, how will future generations recognize its rise and fall? If inequality leaves no architecture behind, how will it be remembered? The stones of the Gilded Age endure because they were heavy enough to resist erasure. The structures of the present may not be. In this sense, the Gilded Age offers more than a historical parallel. It offers a warning about what becomes invisible when ambition learns to hide. The palaces fell, but they taught. The systems that replaced them may never grant that clarity. What follows, perhaps inevitably, is another reckoning. Not with buildings, but with absence. Not with ruins, but with silence. And history suggests that when silence grows too deep, societies begin once again to search for something solid enough to confront. In the end, the story of Gilded Age architecture does not resolve itself through ruins or preservation alone. It resolves through perspective. What once appeared as the pinnacle of success now reads as a moment of misunderstanding, not of wealth, but of time. The builders believed they were anchoring themselves to the future. In truth, they were recording their present with extraordinary clarity. These buildings failed not because they were poorly made, but because they were built to answer the wrong fear. The fear was not poverty. It was impermanence. And architecture, no matter how massive, was never equipped to solve that. What remains today is not condemnation but contrast. A reminder that power which insists on being seen often misunderstands itself. That permanence cannot be forced through scale, and that legitimacy cannot be purchased in stone. The Gilded Age ended not when the mansions fell, but when belief shifted, quietly, decisively, away from the idea that wealth deserved a monument. The modern world carries this lesson forward in silence. Its wealth hides, its power abstracts, its architecture retreats. And yet, the same questions persist, only harder to locate. Who benefits? Who is excluded? And what will remain when the systems of the present finally move on? The old buildings still stand where they were allowed to survive. They do not ask to be admired. They ask to be understood. They ask whether societies learn more from what they preserve or from what they choose to erase. History does not repeat itself perfectly, but it remembers patterns, and the stones of the Gilded Age, heavy and unyielding, continue to offer one final service. They make visible what later eras chose to hide. That visibility may be their true legacy. However, Even after the final conclusions seemed to have been decided, the story refused to end completely. For architecture, unlike narrative, does not end when interpretation ends. The architectural works of the Golden Age continue to occupy physical space, and in doing so, they continue to participate in the present. Their presence is not passive. It has reshaped cities, how we remember ourselves, how nations interpret their past, and how individuals interpret success, failure, and legacy. In cities like New York, Chicago, and Boston, the absence of demolished mansions is as significant as the existence of preserved ones. Entire avenues once shaped by private power now look ordinary, even anonymous. Glass towers rise where limestone palaces once stood, effectively erasing the memory of exclusivity. Most passers-by no longer recognize what has been lost, or why it mattered. And that forgetfulness is not accidental. It is part of how societies transform excess. By blurring its physical traces, they make ethical questions easier to overlook. But forgetfulness is never complete. It exists in fragments, printed photographs, archived floor plans, in streets with unusually wide setbacks, in the names of neighborhoods shaped by fortunes now gone. The city remembers even when its inhabitants are gone, and those who seek can still read the faint traces of fading ambition, subtly etched into the urban network. The very conservation movement reflects this contradiction. On the surface, it seems to celebrate craftsmanship, beauty, and historical value. And rightly so. But preservation also changes meaning. A mansion transformed into a museum is no longer a symbol of exclusion, but of education. A private dining room becomes a gallery. A servant's corridor becomes an interpretive exhibition. Hierarchy dissolves into storytelling. Architecture is preserved, but its power is neutralized. This transformation is neither skeptical nor purely pragmatic. It reflects a deeper negotiation between admiration and discomfort. Society does not want to destroy everything it once envied, nor does it want to glorify it without critical judgment. Preservation becomes a compromise, a way to retain evidence without endorsing the ideology that created it. However, even when preserved, these spaces resist complete domestication. Their scale overwhelms modern sensibilities. Their inefficiency challenges contemporary logic. Standing within them, visitors often experience a contradictory reaction: astonishment mixed with unease. That tension is not a flaw. It is the crux of the matter. Because the most important function of Gilded Age architecture today is not aesthetics. It is diagnostic. These buildings show how wealth behaves when it reveals insecurity. They show how power externalizes anxiety. They demonstrate what happens when money attempts to solve problems of identity, legitimacy, and memory through material excess. This pattern is not unique to the 19th century. It repeats itself whenever economic transformation exceeds moral consensus, whenever a new elite emerges faster than the capacity of social trust to accommodate it, whenever systems reward accumulation without requiring integration. The Gilded Age was simply the point at which this model became inescapable. The digital age, however abstract, is no exception. Its invisibility may delay confrontation, but it doesn't erase the consequences. Power still seeks form. It still leaves traces. They are just harder to see and easier to erase. Data centers replace palaces. Private capital replaces estates. Influence replaces facades. The architecture of power has become dispersed, but its logic remains recognizable. And perhaps that is why the old stone slabs still matter. Not because they represent a better or worse past, but because they offer clarity. They make what the modern system seeks to conceal tangible. They allow future generations to study failure in its physical form, to step over it, to measure it, to feel its weight. In that sense, the Golden Age left a legacy, though not the legacy its builders desired. They sought immortality. Instead, what they achieved was a lesson. Their architectural works became cautionary texts, written in marble and steel, legible long after the authors lost control.